This is Chapter 6, talking about the skeletal system, specifically about bone tissue. So bone is an organ that's going to be made up of lots of different types of tissue. There's going to be bone tissue, as well as cartilage, as well as dense connective tissue, some adipose tissue, as well as nervous tissue. And these are all going to work together to make up the organ system that we know as bone. So the entire framework of bones, as well as their cartilage, is all going to come together to constitute the skeletal system. So functionally, bones are going to have a couple of different main functions in the skeletal system. The functions of the skeletal system are going to be to provide support as well as protection to the internal organs. They're also going to assist in bodily movements. They're also going to be very important in mineral homeostasis, which we'll talk about as we go through this lecture. Hematopoiesis is also going to be a main function of bones, which again we'll talk about as we go through this lecture. And then storage of triglycerides. So all of these are going to be very important functions of the skeletal system. So looking at each of these individually. Support. Obviously we all kind of know that the skeleton is going to serve as that structural framework for the bodies. And it does this by supporting soft tissues as well as providing attachment points for the various tendons that are going to be, of most of that skeletal muscle. The next function of the bone in the skeletal system is blood cell production, also called hematopoiesis. So within certain bones, there's going to be a connective tissue called red bone marrow that's responsible for producing red blood cells, as well as white blood cells and platelets. They're going to be making up blood. So this whole process, like we mentioned, is called hematopoiesis. Red bone marrow is also going to consist of developing blood cells, adipocytes, as well as fibroblasts and macrophages, all within a network of reticular fibers. So it is going to be present in developing bones of the fetus, as well as some of the bones in the adult skeleton as well. In the adults, this is going to be bones like the hip or the pelvic bones, the ribs, the sternum, the bones of the thigh, the femur, as well as the humerus. These are all going to contain red bone marrow. In newborns, all bone marrow is going to be red bone marrow, and this is going to all be involved in hematopoiesis. And then as age increases, much of that red bone marrow is going to change into yellow bone marrow. So the skeletal system overall is going to be very important for, like we said, the production of blood cells. The next function of bone in the skeletal system is assistance in movement. This is another one that's kind of obvious. This is going to be because most skeletal muscles are going to attach to bones, and when these muscles contract, they're going to pull on the bones to produce some sort of movement. Our next main function of the bones in the skeletal system is mineral homeostasis. This is going to be the storage and release of various types of minerals that are going to be really important for maintaining homeostasis in the body. So the bone is going to store several different kinds of minerals, but especially calcium and phosphorus. These two minerals are going to contribute to the strength of the bone, but they're also going to be very important minerals in other parts of the body as well. So bone tissue is going to store about 99% of the body's calcium, and based on the demands of the body, bone is able to release these minerals into the blood in order to help to maintain that balance of mineral levels, to maintain homeostatic levels. And it's also going to be used to distribute the minerals to other parts of the body. Our next function is protection. The skeleton is going to provide protection. It's going to provide a large amount of protection to those internal organs, preventing any sort of injury. So, for example, the cranial bones are going to protect the brain. The rib cage protects the heart and the lungs. Really great source of protection. It's kind of like an internal suit of armor for those organs. And then our last function is going to be triglyceride storage. So we've mentioned this yellow and these red types of bone marrow, and we mentioned that red bone marrow produces blood cells. Well, yellow bone marrow is going to be consisting primarily of adipocytes, And this is going to be where we're going to store large amounts of triglyceride. So these stored triglycerides are going to be a potential energy reserve that the body can use as need be in times of need. So there are lots of different types of bones, and we classify them based on a couple of different things, but one of the main ways that we are able to classify bones is based on their shape. So almost all of the bones in the body can be classified into one of the 5 main types of bone based on their shape. So long bones are going to be greater in length than they are in width. A great example of this is the humerus, which you can see here, that upper arm bone. Next we have our short bones. These are going to be sort of a cube-shaped bone. These are going to make up some of the bones in the wrist, as well as in the feet, or in the ankles. We have flat bones. These are going to be thin layers of parallel plates. A great example of this is your sternum or your breastbone. Irregular bones are going to have just sort of a wonky, kind of crazy, irregular shape, hence the name. These are also just have complex shapes. They're not just symmetrical or anything like that. The vertebrae are a great example of an irregular bone. And then last but not least, we have our sesamoid bone. And I think these are kind of funny because they are named as such because they are shaped like a sesame seed. And a great example of the sesamoid bone is the patella or the kneecap. So we are able to classify all the various types of the bones in the body based on their shape. We can also classify the types of bones based on their location. So we have sutural bones. These are going to be small extra bone plates that are going to be located in the sutures of the cranial bones. These are going to be what's responsible for holding them together. And then we have the actual sutures themselves, and these are going to be the jointed areas where flat bones are going to come together. And we talk a lot about sutures when we talk about the cranium and the various bones that make up the actual cranium itself. We've got those suture bones as well that are going to help to form those sutures holding those various bones together. So we've talked about how we can classify these different types of bone, but let's look at the actual structure of a bone, specifically the long bones, because they're going to have they're going to be kind of your standard looking bone, and they're going to have some just very distinct anatomical parts. All right. So for starters, we have the diaphysis. This is going to be the shaft of the bone. You can see that here, the diaphysis. And then on either end of that, we're going to have the epiphysis. All right. So this is going to be on top. This is going to be on both ends of the bone, and this is going to be where we have where that bone is going to articulate with another bone. They're going to be at those joints. And then we have the metaphysis, which is going to be between the epiphysis and the diaphysis in this middle bit. And this is the region, the region between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Next, we have the articular cartilage that's going to cover both of those epiphyses, those two epiphyses. And this is going to be articular cartilage. This is going to be cartilage that's going to help to protect those bones as they form joints with other bones. Then we have something called a periosteum, and this is going to be the connective tissue that's going to surround the diaphysis. So it wraps around the length of that bone, which you can see here. They've kind of peeled it back. Then we have a medullary cavity. This is going to be the hollow space within the actual diaphysis of the bone. And then the thin membrane that lines that medullary cavity is called the endosteum. All right. So all of these things are going to make up the overall structure of the long bone. So we've mentioned the diaphysis, the shaft of the long bone, and then the epiphysis, those two ends of the bone that are going to articulate with adjacent bones. We've mentioned those two. But it's also important to mention that in the metaphysis, there's going to be that area between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. There's going to be something called an epiphyseal plate. And this is going to be, you can see that right here, and you can actually also see it in the in this actual image of actual bone here. It's called the epiphyseal line in this image right here. So this epiphyseal plate is going to be the main site of bone growth, specifically bone elongation. So this is what's going to allow for those bones to grow longer in length. Also, it's important to mention that articular cartilage that's going to be on either end of the bones. It's going to cover the epiphysis on both sides. This is going to be a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. It's going to be at both ends of the bone, and this is going to help to reduce friction as well as to absorb shock at freely movable joints. And then we've also mentioned the periosteum, that connective tissue covering on the surface of bones. And this is going to contain our osteogenic cells. These are cells that promote bone growth and width, as well as assisting in fracture repair. They're going to help to nourish the bone, and they also are going to, this periosteum is also going to serve as an excellent attachment point for the various ligaments and tendons of the skeletal muscles to aid in movement. Moving on, then the space that's within our diaphysis, within the actual shaft of the bone, is called the medullary cavity, also known as the marrow cavity. And this is where we're going to have that yellow bone marrow or any kind of adipose connective tissue, where that's going to reside in that medullary cavity. And then the lining of that medullary cavity, like we mentioned, is the endosteum. So, now that we've looked at the general anatomy of the bones, we can look at the actual histology of the bones now. Bones are going to contain an abundance of extracellular matrix that's going to be surrounded, it's going to surround widely separated cells. So it is mostly, it's a lot of extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix is about 15% water, then 30% collagen, and 55% crystallized mineral salts. So that's what's going to give it the hardness that we associate with bone. So one of the processes that's very important when we talk about bone tissue in general is the process of calcification or mineralization. So this is what is going to provide that bones with that hardness. The most abundant of these mineral salts in the bone is calcium phosphate. So it's going to combine with another mineral salt called calcium hydroxide, and this is going to form crystals of hydroxyapatite. So as those crystals form, they're going to combine with other mineral salts, things like calcium carbonate, as well as other ions like magnesium, fluoride, potassium, sulfate, all that kind of stuff. These are going to combine with those hydroxyapatite crystals. As these mineral salts are going to be deposited in a framework that's going to be formed by those collagen fibers of the extracellular matrix, they're going to crystallize and they're going to harden, provide hardness for the tissue. So this is what's going to be, the tissue is going to harden. So this whole process is going to be initiated by bone building cells called osteoblasts. The process of calcification is going to require the presence of those collagen fibers, however. So mineral salts are first going to begin to crystallize in the microscopic spaces that are between those collagen fibers that are forming that matrix. And then after those spaces are filled, the mineral crystals are going to accumulate around the actual collagen fibers themselves. So the combination of crystallized salts and collagen fibers are going to be responsible for the characteristics of bone, that sort of hardness, with a fairly good amount of tensile strength. So although the bone's hardness is going to depend on the crystallized inorganic bones, the bone's flexibility is going to be due in large part to the presence of those collagen fibers. So just like reinforcing metal bars in concrete, like rebar with concrete, collagen fibers are going to be like the rebar. And those other organic molecules are going to provide the tensile strength. This is the resistance to being stretched or torn apart. So if you were to take a bone and soak it in an acidic solution like vinegar, dissolving all of those mineral salts, you'd be left with a weird kind of rubbery, flexible bone, because you would dissolve away all of those mineral salts and be left with just the collagen fiber network. And that's why it would be that kind of flexible, rubbery sort of feel. So it'd be, it's a very weird feeling, but anyhow. So it's this combination of mineral salts that provide this hardness and the strength, and then the collagen fibers that allow for some degree of flexibility and an increase in tensile strength. So those two things working together are going to give us that characteristic bone that we know so well. So now let's look at now talking about the histology of the bone, let's look at the actual cells that are going to be responsible for building or making up this bone. So we have four main types of cells that are associated with bone. We have osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. Osteoprogenitor cells are going to be our bone stem cells. These are able to still differentiate into other types of cells, and they're also able to undergo cell division. Our osteoblasts are going to be our bone building cells. These are going to secrete that extracellular matrix for the bone. And then osteocytes are mature bone cells, and osteoclasts are the cells that are responsible for remodeling bone and causing them to release the calcium. So one way to remember the difference here is that osteoblasts build bone, while osteoclasts carve out bone. Right? So looking at each of these types of bone cells individually. First, we have our osteoprogenitor cells. These are going to be just unspecialized bone stem cells. They're going to be derived from the mesenchyme, and this is the tissue from which all of the connective tissues are going to be formed. That's the mesenchyme. So these osteoprogenitor cells are unspecialized, so they're able to differentiate into the different types of bone cells. These osteoprogenitor cells are the only bone cells that are able to undergo cell division. And the resulting cells are going to develop into osteoblasts. So osteoprogenitor cells are going to be found along the inner portion of the periosteum in the endosteum, and in the canals within the bones that are going to contain blood vessels. So that's where those are all the places that we would find an osteoprogenitor cell that are responsible for dividing and producing more bone cells, specifically osteoblasts. So next up we have our osteoblasts. These are our bone building cells. These are the cells that are responsible for synthesizing and secreting those collagen fibers that are going to be the framework of the bone. And they're also going to secrete and synthesize some of those other organic components that are going to be needed to build the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. They're also going to help to initiate the whole process of calcification. So as these osteoblasts surround themselves with that extracellular matrix, they're going to become trapped in their secretions, and then they're going to develop further into osteocytes. So they kind of paint themselves into a corner, which you can sort of see here. So they're just basically, and you can see this when we look under the microscope too, how they've basically surrounded themselves in extracellular matrix. So it's important to note for this, just a little bit of word anatomy, that the ending blast in a name of a bone or of a bone cell or any other kind of connective tissue cell is going to indicate that this is a cell that secretes extracellular matrix. So a fibroblast is a cell that secretes some sort of extracellular matrix fibers. Just like a osteoblast is going to be the cell that is responsible for secreting the extracellular matrix for bone. Next, we have our osteocytes. So these are mature bone cells, and they're going to be the main cells in bone tissues. These are going to have developed from the the osteoblast line. So once an osteoblast fully develops, it becomes an osteocyte. These are the cells that are going to be responsible for maintaining the daily metabolic activities of the bone tissue. So things like exchanging nutrients and waste with the blood, and like osteoblasts and just like osteoblasts, these osteocytes are not going to be able to undergo cell division. It's just those osteoprogenitor cells of this lineage that are going to be able to do that. So again, with the word anatomy, the ending site at the end of a cell, at the end of this bone cell or any other sort of tissue, means that the cell is going to maintain and monitor the various tissue that it's associated with. So this is our osteocytes. And then last but not least, we have our osteoclasts. So these are a little bit different because up until now, all of the cells, the three cells that we've mentioned, our osteoprogenitor, osteoblast, and osteoclast, have all come from the same lineage. They've all come from that progenitor cells that is going to give rise to our osteoblast, that is going to develop into our osteoclast. Excuse me, I misspoke. So our osteoprogenitor cells are going to give rise to osteoblasts that give rise to osteocytes. My apologies. Osteoclasts are different because these are going to have a white blood cell lineage. They're going to be derived from some sort of white blood cells, specifically monocytes. So these are big, huge cells that are going to be derived from the fusion of as many as 50 or more monocytes, which are a type of white blood cell or an immune cell, and they are going to be concentrated primarily in the endosteum. So on the side of the cell that faces the bone surface, the osteoclast is going to have a plasma membrane that's going to have lots of deep folds, and it's going to make it look like it has ruffles. This is called the ruffled border, which you can see kind of animated and illustrated here. So this ruffled border is going to be where the cells are going to release enzymes and acids that are responsible for digesting the extracellular bone matrix. Within, So this is going to cause the breakdown of bone extracellular matrix, and this whole process is called bone resorption. And this is part of the normal development, maintenance, and repair of bone. Perfectly normal. So just remembering, ending osteoclast means that the cell is going to break down extracellular matrix. So we've got a couple of different types of bones that we can look at. Right? We've got compact bone, and this is going to be the strongest type of bone, and it's found beneath the periosteum. This is a kind of bone that's going to provide great support and protection. And then the other type of bone that we have is spongy bone, and this is a lightweight type of bone, and it's going to provide great tissue support. So starting with compact bone, this compact bone tissue is going to be composed of repeating structural units called osteons, also sometimes called Harvasian systems, but for consistency's sake, we're going to stick with osteons. So each osteon is going to consist of concentric lamella, and these are going to be arranged our osteonic or Harvasian canal. So here we've got our osteon right here, our unit, our structural unit. Then our concentric lamella, these are the little individual rings. And in the middle, we're going to have our osteonic canal. This is where we're going to have blood vessels entering and leaving the bone. So, resembling the growth rings of a tree, our concentric lamella are going to be circular plates of mineralized extracellular matrix that are going to be of increasingly large diameter. These are going to surround a small network of blood vessels and nerves that are going to be located in our central canal right there. So these tube-like units of bone are generally going to form a series of parallel cylinders that, in long bones, are going to tend to run parallel to the long axis of the bone. So between our little concentric lamella are going to be small spaces called lacuna. And this is where the osteocytes are going to reside. So radiating in all directions from the lacuna are going to be these tiny little canaliculi. So we've got our lacuna, their osteocyte, and then our canaliculi coming off of that. And these canaliculi are going to be filled with extracellular fluid. So inside the canaliculi are going to be slender finger-like projections that are going to come off of the osteocytes. And neighboring osteocytes are going to be able to communicate via gap junctions that are connecting those cells by connecting canaliculi. The canaliculi are going to connect the lacuna with one another and with the central canals. And this is going to form an intricate kind of miniature-looking system of interconnecting canals throughout the bone. This system is going to provide several different routes for nutrients as well as oxygen to reach those osteoclasts, as well as to remove any sort of waste products that may be generated from just general metabolic work. The area that's in between The neighboring osteons is going to contain lamella, and this is called interstitial lamella, and which is also going to have lacuna with osteocytes and canaliculi. The interstitial lamella are going to be fragments of older osteons that have been partly destroyed during their bone rebuilding process. And so you can kind of see some of these here. They're interstitial lamella. They're not quite so round anymore. The blood vessels as well as the nerves from the periosteum are going to penetrate the compact bone through transverse osteonic canals, also called Volkmann's canals. These are vessels. The vessels and the nerves of the interosteonic canals are going to connect with those of the medullary cavity, as well as the periosteum and the central canal. So this is kind of where everything's all connected and working together. Then arranged around the center, around the entire outer and inner circumference of the shaft of the long bone, which you can see here, are going to be lamella called circumferential lamella, and these are going to develop during the initial bone formation process. The circumferential lamella that are directly deep to the periosteum are called external circumferential lamella, and then on the inside they would be called internal circumferential lamella on the inner, lining the medullary cavity. So these are our external concentric lamella, and you can see they are shaped a little bit differently too. These external circumferential lamella are going to be connected to the periosteum by something called a Sharpie's fiber or a perforating fiber. And this is what's going to help to kind of attach that periosteum to that underlying layer of bone. And then, like we mentioned, the circumferential lamella that line the medullary cavity are called the internal circumferential lamella. So we've mentioned about osteons and how they tend to line up along the long axis of the bone. And this is a lot of the times due to the lines of stress that that particular bone is going to encounter. This is because osteons are going to align in the same direction along lines of stress. So these lines are going to sometimes change as the stress on the bone changes. So here we can see how the lines of these osteons have arranged themselves in the femur here, where you can see the lines of stress based on how that bone is going to attach to, is basically attaching the leg to the hip there, and how it's redirecting those lines of stress, and how the osteons have arranged to accommodate that. So osteons in compact bone tissue are going to align in the same direction and are parallel to the length of the bone of that, parallel to the length of the diaphysis. So as a result, the shaft of a long bone is going to resist any kind of bending or fracture, even when a pretty significant force is applied to it on either end. Compact bone tissue is also going to tend to be the thickest in those parts of the bone where stress is applied in relatively few directions. So the lines of stress in the bone are not static. They are capable of changing. So as a person learns to walk, and in response to some sort of repeated strenuous sort of physical activity, like things like weight training, all of these things can cause changes in the lines of stress, and therefore in the alignment of those osteons. Another possible reason that lines of stress could change would be if a person has a fracture or some sort of physical deformity that causes weight to be distributed differently along that bone. Another reason that, or functionally, I guess, another way that we can look at lines of stress changing is when we talk about braces. So the dental alveoli that those teeth are going to fit into, we apply pressure on the teeth, and this causes basically a shifting in the lines of stress in those little tooth joints to help straighten them out so that they can be aligned in whatever way that orthodontists see fit. So this is just an application of stress to change the lines of stress in the bones themselves. So you're not really shifting the teeth, you're just reshaping the joints that hold the teeth in, and this causes them to straighten out. So thus this whole reorganization of osteoclasts is not going to be a static thing. It's going to change over time in response to the varying physical demands that are placed on the skeleton itself. The other type of bone that we're going to talk about, the other type of bone tissue, is called spongy bone. And this is also sometimes called cancellous bone. And this does not have, this is not going to contain osteons. Instead, it's going to consist of trabeculae, which you can see here, these kind of staghorn-like projections. These are going to be surrounded many of the red bone marrow-filled spaces. So this is going to form most of the anterior structure of short, flat, and irregular bones, and it's also going to be the epiphysis of long bones. Spongy bone tissue is going to be light, and it's going to provide open spaces for red bone marrow to preside, as well, and as such, it's going to be a major site of hematopoiesis. So a lot of blood production is going on here. So in contrast to compact bone, spongy bone is very different. Spongy bone is also referred to as trabecular or cancellous bone tissue, and like we mentioned, it doesn't contain any osteons. The spongy bone is always going to be located in the interior of a bone, and this is going to be protected by the covering of a covering or a layer of compact bone to kind of keep it from being smushed. It's going to consist of lamella that are going to be arranged in irregular patterns of thin columns called trabeculae. Like we mentioned, this sort of staghorn-looking projections that we see right here. These are our trabeculae. And then in the empty space that's created by the trabeculae, this is where the red bone marrow is going to reside. But as you can see, it's still made up of lamella. So between the trabeculae there are going to be spaces that are actually, you're able to see spaces in these in the bone, in the spongy bone. And we'll actually take a look at some of this when we get to the lab later. These macroscopic or larger spaces that are in the bone are going to be filled with red bone marrow, and this is going to be a major site of blood cell production. And then the yellow bone marrow, the adipose tissue, is also going to be found in some of these in the other types of bone. Both types of bone marrow are going to contain numerous small blood vessels that are going to be there to provide nourishment to those osteocytes. And each trabeculae is going to consist of concentric lamella, as well as osteocytes that are going to lie within those lacuna, like we've seen before, as well as canaliculae that radiate outwards from the lacuna. So you can see all of those here, our canaliculae with our osteocyte residing within that lacuna, and all of these are going to make up the lamella that are going to form this trabecular bone, this spongy bone. So spongy bone is different than compact bone in two main ways. Spongy bone tissue is going to be light, and this is going to help to reduce the overall weight of the bone. So this reduction in weight is going to allow the bones to move more readily when pulled on by skeletal muscles. If a bone was just entirely compact bone, we would weigh a ton, and it would be a whole lot more work to move our muscles and move our skeleton because it would be so dense and heavy. The second main way that spongy bone is different than compact bone is that the trabeculae of the spongy bone tissue are going to support and protect the red bone marrow, as opposed to the yellow bone marrow that we would see often in compact bone. So spongy bone that's in the hip bones, as well as the ribs and the sternum, also in the vertebrae, and the proximal ends of the humerus and the femur, are going to be the only real sites where red bone marrow is stored, and are therefore going to be major sites of hematopoiesis, that's at least in adults. Like we've mentioned before, hematopoiesis, or these red bone marrow, can be found in all of the bones in a newborn infant. But as we age and become adults, this reduces down to just these sites that we mentioned previously. So this is going to be where we're going to have our main hematopoiesis occurring in adults. Last but not least, we're going to talk just briefly, mention the blood supply and nerve supply for bones in general, but we're not going to get into any kind of great detail. So the periosteal arteries are going to enter the diaphysis of a bone through the Volkmann's canals. These are also called interosteonic canals, and they are going to also be accompanied by the periosteal veins. So the periosteal arteries are bringing oxygenated blood in, while the periosteal veins are removing deoxygenated blood. The nutrient artery is going to enter from the center of the diaphysis through the nutrient foramen, and then the nutrient vein is also going to exit the same canal. So the metaphyses and the epiphyses of the bone is also going to have their own arteries and veins that are associated with it. These are going to be the epiphyseal artery and vein, etc. The nerves are essentially going to follow the vessels into the bone tissue and the periosteum, where they're going to sense any sort of damage or transmit pain. This is how you know you've broken a bone, is because it hurts, because those that damage is being detected as pain by those nerves that serve that bone. So that is all that we have for the first part of the bone tissue lecture. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me.